The problem isn't what you think it is. We have been systematically, relentlessly, and deeply conditioned over thousands of years of human civilization to entirely externalize the agonizing source of our deepest miseries, our most crippling fears, and our most profound, inescapable failures. The deeply entrenched, highly comfortable societal and religious narrative insists that absolute evil is a highly visible, incredibly grotesque physical entity, a terrifying, horned mythological beast wielding a heavy pitchfork, presiding over a subterranean, fiery abyss of eternal physical torment, aggressively hunting for innocent human souls to violently drag into the dark, suffocating depths of hell. We desperately, entirely eagerly cling to this deeply fabricated, highly theatrical illusion because it provides a profoundly comforting, entirely cowardly psychological excuse. If the architect of our ruin is a massive, supernatural monster entirely outside of our biological control, then we are completely, tragically absolved of the incredibly heavy, entirely terrifying burden of ultimate personal responsibility. But the deeply controversial, heavily suppressed, and intensely terrifying narrative hidden within the incredibly guarded pages of this historically silenced manuscript violently, aggressively tears down this ancient, comforting mythology, exposing a psychological reality so profoundly sinister and deeply insidious that the author's own family locked the physical manuscript entirely away in a dark, silent vault for more than 70 years, completely terrified of the societal earthquake its publication would inevitably trigger. The epic, intensely psychological story plunges us directly into an entirely surreal, heavily shadowed, and deeply allegorical interrogation space, introducing us to a fiercely determined, highly relentless seeker of truth who has reached the absolute, devastating breaking point of his own fragile mortal existence. This relentless seeker, having spent grueling, entirely exhausting decades meticulously analyzing the triumphant, soaring architecture of immense historical human success, suddenly finds himself entirely, violently plunged into the dark, suffocating, and incredibly paralyzing abyss of the Great Depression. He is entirely stripped of his massive, hard-won financial wealth, deeply stripped of his towering social status, and completely, violently stripped of his own internal psychological certainty. He is wandering completely blindly through a terrifying, chaotic, and entirely unforgiving global economic collapse, his mind heavily besieged by deep, paralyzing terror, profound existential despair, and a deeply suffocating, entirely biological fear of imminent starvation and absolute, irrecoverable ruin. It is precisely here, at the absolute, terrifying rock bottom of human psychological endurance, in the very darkest, most entirely desolate night of his deeply fractured soul, that the exhausted seeker completely, miraculously manages to aggressively corner the absolute most elusive, deeply terrifying, and entirely pervasive antagonist in the known, massive universe, driven by an incredibly fierce, completely unyielding, and entirely desperate burst of absolute sovereign willpower. He forces a brutal, highly intense, and completely uncompromising interrogation upon the devil himself. Yet, the entity that begins to speak from the heavy, suffocating darkness of the seeker's own deeply fractured consciousness is absolutely not a mythological, physical beast of rotting flesh and searing brimstone. It is an incredibly vast, profoundly intelligent, deeply formless, and entirely invisible negative energy, a highly cosmic, deeply psychological force that confidently, heavily arrogantly boasts of exercising absolute, unquestionable, and entirely flawless executive control over a staggering, deeply terrifying 98% of the entire global human population. This deeply dark, formless energy absolutely does not forcefully rule the massive, struggling human herd through overt physical violence, heavy militaristic tyranny, or entirely visible chains of iron. It rules entirely, flawlessly, and completely perfectly through the incredibly subtle, highly insidious, and entirely invisible weaponization of human psychology itself, actively, aggressively turning the magnificent, incredibly powerful, and highly capable human brain entirely, violently against its own sovereign potential. The deeply grueling, incredibly intense, and highly terrifying interrogation commences with the dark, entirely formless entity coldly, profoundly revealing the absolute, primary, and incredibly devastating psychological weapon it masterfully utilizes to successfully, flawlessly enslave the vast, overwhelming, and deeply tragic majority of modern mankind. The shadow proudly, deeply maliciously describes an incredibly toxic, highly pervasive, and entirely passive psychological state of human existence that it casually, clinically refers to as drifting. A drifter, the deeply arrogant entity explains with terrifying, highly absolute clarity, is absolutely any human being who entirely willingly, completely passively, and deeply fearfully surrenders the magnificent, highly sovereign privilege and the grueling, heavily demanding biological burden of independent, entirely autonomous, and deeply highly critical thought. They are the deeply exhausted, completely uninspired, highly reactive, and entirely passive masses of humanity who simply, tragically allow the incredibly chaotic, heavily manipulated, highly loud, and entirely unpredictable circumstances of the external, physical world to entirely, completely dictate their internal psychological beliefs, their daily, highly unexamined actions, and their ultimate, entirely final mortal destiny. The deeply paralyzed drifter absolutely, fundamentally never deliberately defines a singular, incredibly burning, highly focused, and entirely non-negotiable personal purpose. They wander completely blindly, entirely aimlessly, and deeply anxiously through their incredibly brief, highly finite, and deeply precious mortal existence, desperately, constantly seeking the absolute, highly comforting path of least cognitive and physical resistance. They blindly, eagerly, and entirely foolishly accept the deeply flawed, heavily toxic, and entirely limiting societal dogmas handed down to them by completely arbitrary, often deeply corrupt external authorities. They passively, continuously consume the incredibly chaotic, heavily fear-inducing, and entirely manipulated narratives aggressively broadcasted by the deeply cynical modern world, and they completely, tragically, and entirely predictably fold, instantly collapsing at the very first, entirely inevitable, and highly mathematically certain sign of physical hardship, deeply emotional failure, or highly aggressive societal criticism. The dark, entirely formless entity claims absolute, entirely undisputed, and completely permanent ownership over the fragile drifter's soul, gleefully, deeply maliciously explaining that it requires absolutely zero incredibly active, highly aggressive, or deeply strenuous effort to completely capture them. The heavily terrified, completely unthinking drifter entirely voluntarily, highly eagerly walks directly into the massive, invisible psychological prison simply by deeply, profoundly, and entirely completely refusing to actively, fiercely utilize their own conscious mind. The entity deeply arrogantly reveals that it absolutely does not have to violently drag a human being into hell. It simply has to quietly, incredibly subtly encourage them to stop thinking entirely for themselves, and they will completely, flawlessly construct their own entirely inescapable, deeply agonizing psychological hell right here on the physical earth. In stark, completely blinding, and highly terrifying contrast, the entity violently, incredibly deeply despises and heavily, fundamentally fears the incredibly rare, highly sovereign individual it identifies as the non-drifter. This incredibly fierce, deeply powerful, and entirely unshakable individual is someone who fiercely, aggressively, and entirely completely thinks entirely for themselves. They possess a massive, entirely unyielding, highly defined, and deeply definite major purpose that burns incredibly fiercely within their deeply protected consciousness. They absolutely, completely refuse to be entirely defined, deeply restricted, or highly crushed by external, completely inevitable failures, deeply agonizing, incredibly painful setbacks, or highly toxic, heavily ignorant societal criticism. The non-drifter fiercely, heavily protects their own incredibly sacred psychological borders, heavily, rigorously analyzing every single passing thought, actively, fiercely questioning every deeply entrenched, heavily inherited belief, and completely, entirely refusing to ever, under any incredibly difficult, entirely terrifying circumstance, surrender the heavy, deeply magnificent, and highly sovereign crown of absolute self-determination. The dark entity completely, highly reluctantly admits, with a deep, seething, entirely impotent, and heavily frustrated rage that it absolutely, fundamentally cannot ever penetrate, deeply manipulate, or entirely enslave the heavily fortified mind of an individual who fiercely, continuously, deeply, and entirely autonomously thinks for themselves. The interrogation brilliantly, profoundly exposes the incredibly massive, entirely undeniable illusion of ultimate evil. The devil is absolutely not an external, physical creator of human suffering. The devil is strictly, entirely, and completely the exact, deeply biological absence of conscious, independent human thought. When a human being actively, entirely passively abdicates their ultimate, highest cognitive function, they immediately, violently create a massive, entirely dark psychological vacuum within their own heavily compromised mind, and this deeply pervasive, entirely negative cosmic energy instantly, flawlessly rushes in to entirely fill the void, seizing complete, absolute, and entirely permanent executive control. To deeply, profoundly understand this staggering, entirely world-altering revelation is to completely, violently take back the incredibly heavy, entirely terrifying, but completely absolute reins of personal mortal destiny. The incredible, highly analytical portion of this incredibly intense narrative forces the profoundly awakened reader to deeply, uncomfortably examine their own daily, highly habitual existence. We are violently confronted with the terrifying, deeply profound question of our own psychological sovereignty. How many of our deeply held, incredibly cherished political, religious, and economic beliefs are truly, actually our own deeply analyzed, entirely original conclusions, and how many are simply, tragically the highly unexamined, entirely passive echoes of the specific, heavily manipulated environment we were accidentally born into? Every single time we entirely blindly accept a highly limiting societal narrative. Every time we entirely cowardly shrink away from a massive, highly intimidating challenge because we are deeply, biologically paralyzed by the incredibly toxic fear of what other, completely mediocre people might loudly, ignorantly say about us. We are actively, entirely eagerly signing a deeply binding, highly irreversible psychological contract with this completely formless, deeply negative energy, the absolute, incredible genius of this incredibly dark, highly hidden philosophy is its entirely unyielding, completely brutal demand for total, absolute psychological independence. It mathematically, entirely brilliantly proves that the absolute greatest, most incredibly devastating tragedy of the entire human experience is not that we are actively, violently destroyed by a massive, angry, entirely external cosmic force, but that we entirely, tragically, and completely passively allow our own incredibly massive, highly infinite, and deeply divine potential to quietly, silently wither away simply because we are entirely, deeply too lazy, highly too fearful, and completely too heavily conditioned to actively, fiercely stand up and entirely claim complete, absolute ownership over the magnificent, incredibly powerful biological machine operating directly inside our own fragile skulls. The profoundly exhausted, deeply transformed seeker realizes with a sudden, icy, and incredibly clear wave of total comprehension that the absolute only highly effective, completely guaranteed, and entirely invincible defense mechanism against this massive, completely insidious, and deeply dark cosmic energy is the fierce, relentless, entirely uncompromising, and completely unyielding daily practice of extreme, highly aggressive cognitive awareness, setting the incredibly intense, highly dramatic stage for the profoundly terrifying, completely mathematical revelation of the exact, highly specific cosmic mechanics the entity utilizes to permanently, entirely irreversibly lock the passive drifter into an absolute, deeply concrete, and entirely unbreakable destiny of total, agonizing failure. The incredibly relentless, deeply profound interrogation pushes violently forward into the absolute, terrifying core of the dark entity's incredibly vast, entirely cosmic operational mechanics. The profoundly awakened seeker, entirely refusing to relent, aggressively demands to fully, completely understand the exact, inescapable physical and psychological law that permanently, entirely irreversibly binds the tragically passive drifter to their deeply miserable, heavily compromised fate. it is here, in the incredibly heavy, deeply suffocating silence of the metaphorical interrogation space, that the shadowy, entirely formless entity introduces a concept so incredibly massive, deeply terrifying, and completely universal that it fundamentally alters the seeker's entire understanding of human biological and cognitive destiny. The entity deeply arrogantly, highly clinically describes the incredibly inescapable, heavily rhythmic, and entirely cosmic force known as hypnotic rhythm. This profoundly massive, completely universal law strictly, ruthlessly dictates that absolutely every single repeated human thought, every deeply habitual physical action, and every continuously indulged emotional state is completely, inevitably captured by the natural, highly oscillating rhythms of the physical universe. The dark, formless energy heavily, maliciously explains that nature completely, utterly abhors a vacuum and absolutely requires deep, permanent order. Therefore, when a deeply fragile, entirely terrified human being actively, entirely passively indulges in the heavily toxic, completely unthinking behavior of chronic drifting, the incredibly massive cosmic force of hypnotic rhythm silently, completely invisibly begins to spin a deeply adhesive, highly restrictive psychological web entirely around them. Initially, in the absolute earliest, highly vulnerable stages of this cognitive decay, these incredibly fine, highly invisible threads of entirely negative habit are deeply weak and incredibly easily broken by a sudden, incredibly fierce burst of conscious, deeply sovereign willpower. But as the deeply passive, heavily terrified individual continuously, entirely unconsciously repeats their incredibly toxic, highly limiting behaviors over long stretches of highly finite mortal time, the incredibly fine threads heavily, rapidly multiply, violently thickening into incredibly massive, deeply unbreakable, and highly restrictive steel cables of absolute, permanent destiny. The dark entity coldly, entirely clinically explains that once a completely paralyzed, highly unthinking human being has drifted entirely aimlessly for a sufficient duration, the incredibly powerful, entirely unyielding cosmic force of hypnotic rhythm violently, aggressively seizes complete, absolute, and entirely permanent executive control of their heavily compromised mental architecture. Their deeply toxic, highly fearful thoughts completely, irrevocably become entirely automated, deeply biological responses. The terrifying, highly psychological trap violently, absolutely entirely snaps completely shut, and the incredibly tragic individual is permanently, entirely hopelessly condemned to a deeply agonizing, highly unfulfilled, and completely mediocre mortal existence. They completely, entirely lose the magnificent, highly sovereign ability to actively, fiercely alter their own tragic trajectory completely because their very neurological pathways have been permanently, violently frozen into an incredibly rigid, entirely inescapable architecture of absolute, deeply mathematical failure. The incredibly dark entity gleefully, entirely maliciously admits that extreme, crushing poverty, deep biological illness, and completely crushing emotional despair are absolute, mathematical certainties for any incredibly fragile human being caught deeply in the dark, swirling vortex of a negative hypnotic rhythm. The profound, intensely analytical realization crashes heavily upon the deeply transformed seeker. The universe absolutely does not punish the human being entirely, tragically punishes themselves by passively, blindly allowing the incredibly massive, completely unforgiving laws of physical nature to deeply, permanently cement their own absolute worst, highly destructive psychological habits into an absolute, entirely undeniable physical reality, to further completely, entirely deeply insulate the fiercely focused non-drifter from these incredibly dark, highly insidious manipulations. The deeply profound narrative violently, aggressively exposes the deeply toxic, completely devastating role of massive, heavily institutionalized societal structures. The deeply formless entity arrogantly, highly maliciously boasts that it completely relies upon the highly standardized, deeply globally accepted systems of traditional, heavily mechanized public education and deeply dogmatic, fear-based religious instruction to aggressively, completely violently program incredibly deep, highly paralyzing fear and absolute, entirely cognitive obedience directly into the highly vulnerable, completely fragile minds of incredibly young children. It entirely deeply explains that traditional schools are absolutely, fundamentally designed to ruthlessly, violently beat the magnificent, highly sovereign privilege of independent, entirely original thought completely out of the human mind, heavily substituting it with the deeply toxic, entirely passive habit of mere biological memorization. The entity brags that it utilizes incredibly deep, entirely terrifying threats of eternal, highly physical damnation to completely paralyze the developing human soul with absolute terror, entirely preventing them from ever discovering the immense, deeply beautiful, entirely unshakable power that actively resides directly within their own highly beautiful consciousness. The profoundly awakened seeker incredibly heavily realizes that to absolutely, entirely mathematically outwit this formless, highly dark entity, the sovereign, incredibly powerful individual must aggressively, violently filter their entire cognitive environment, completely absolutely, incredibly ruthlessly rejecting any completely toxic, entirely negative association, any highly paralyzing, fear-based dogmatic influence, and any deeply passive, heavily unthinking individual who heavily threatens to completely violently pull them back down into the completely heavy, highly suffocating mire of absolute, entirely cosmic mediocrity. The fiercely determined, incredibly relentless, and profoundly awakened seeker, having successfully, violently shattered the incredibly dark, deeply deceptive, and heavily fortified psychological illusions meticulously erected by the entirely formless, heavily shadowy entity, now aggressively, completely ruthlessly presses his ultimate, highly unyielding offensive advantage. He entirely, fiercely demands the absolute, incredibly concrete, and deeply undeniable antidote to this incredibly massive, highly toxic, and completely suffocating cognitive poison, the deeply cornered, heavily writhing, and entirely compromised dark energy, completely stripped of its absolute, highly protective secrecy, incredibly agonizingly, deeply reluctantly begins to violently, heavily surrender the absolute most incredibly powerful, entirely liberating, and deeply transformative cosmic secrets in the entire, massive history of human psychological evolution, the deeply profound, highly analytical, and entirely staggering revelation completely, violently exposes the absolute, entirely mathematical, and incredibly beautiful dual nature of the massive, highly cosmic, and completely inescapable force of hypnotic rhythm. The shadowy, deeply dark entity entirely, highly resentfully confesses that while this incredibly massive, completely unyielding physical law absolutely, ruthlessly cements the deeply toxic, highly passive habits of the terrified, completely unthinking drifter into an incredibly inescapable, completely concrete destiny of extreme, crushing poverty, deep biological illness, and entirely overwhelming emotional despair, it simultaneously, incredibly beautifully, and entirely mathematically acts as an incredibly massive, deeply unstoppable, and completely highly exponential cosmic elevator for the fiercely sovereign, incredibly conscious, and entirely resolute non-drifter. When a deeply awakened, incredibly intensely focused human being entirely, actively, and fiercely chooses to deliberately, completely consciously program their own fragile mental architecture with incredibly positive, deeply empowering, and entirely sovereign habits of thought and highly aggressive, completely disciplined physical action, the exact same massive, entirely inescapable cosmic force of hypnotic rhythm violently, aggressively locks those magnificent, highly ascending, and entirely triumphant cognitive patterns into an absolute, deeply permanent, and completely mathematically guaranteed trajectory of monumental, highly staggering, and entirely historically unassailable human success. The incredibly massive, completely universal law is entirely, absolutely fundamentally blind and entirely deeply indifferent to human suffering or human joy. It simply, purely, and entirely mathematically magnifies, deeply violently accelerates, and completely permanently crystallizes whatever specific, deeply highly predominant psychological seeds the individual actively, fiercely chooses to deliberately plant in the incredibly fertile, highly unyielding soil of their own deep subconscious mind, to successfully, flawlessly entirely activate this magnificent, highly ascending cosmic elevator. The immensely powerful, entirely unyielding seeker aggressively forces the dark, entirely formless entity to completely, explicitly detail the absolute, incredibly rigorous, and highly demanding psychological principles of total, complete human liberation. The shadowy entity deeply bitterly, incredibly reluctantly reveals that the absolute, entirely foundational, and completely non-negotiable prerequisite for ultimate, permanent freedom is the fierce, highly aggressive, and entirely uncompromising establishment of a deeply definite major purpose. The incredibly fragile, highly susceptible human mind absolutely must be heavily, violently anchored to a singular, entirely burning, and completely magnificent obsession, entirely preventing the deeply chaotic, highly toxic, and incredibly noisy external world from ever successfully planting entirely negative, deeply paralyzing, and highly fearful suggestions into the incredibly vulnerable subconscious void. However, the deeply profound, highly analytical narrative violently, aggressively warns that possessing an entirely magnificent, highly focused purpose is absolutely, mathematically completely insufficient without the incredibly fierce, deeply unyielding, and completely ironclad execution of absolute mastery over the fragile, highly biological self. The deeply dark, entirely formless entity deeply gleefully, highly arrogantly confesses that it absolutely, effortlessly captures millions of incredibly capable, deeply intelligent human souls by aggressively, ruthlessly encouraging them to severely, entirely completely violently overindulge in the highly physical, deeply comforting pleasures of excessive, incredibly unhealthy food consumption, the deeply unchecked, highly destructive pursuit of purely physical, entirely biological sexual gratification completely devoid of deep, highly profound spiritual connection, and the incredibly toxic, entirely overwhelming desire for constant, highly incredibly shallow societal validation and deeply massive, entirely false ego inflation. The profoundly awakened, deeply analytically driven seeker incredibly deeply realizes that the absolute, entirely critical, deeply mathematically foundational cornerstone of true, absolute, entirely invincible human freedom is the fierce, incredibly unyielding, deeply profound mastery over these fragile, highly biological, and incredibly primitive impulses. The incredibly highly sovereign individual must absolutely, entirely completely violently ruthlessly conquer their own deeply biological, entirely incredibly primitive physical impulses, completely entirely subordinating their deeply physical, entirely incredibly fragile body completely absolutely to the absolute, highly dictatorial, completely sovereign, highly ironclad command of their own entirely conscious, deeply analytically trained, entirely invincible higher mind. Without this absolute, incredibly fierce, deeply entirely unyielding biological and psychological self-discipline, the entirely fragile, deeply susceptible human being is absolutely, entirely mathematically, completely guaranteed to instantly, violently completely fall directly back into the incredibly dark, deeply swirling, highly inescapable vortex of complete, deep, highly absolute drifting. Furthermore, the relentlessly intense, completely unyielding interrogation violently, deeply uncovers the absolute, incredibly transformative, and completely paradigm-shifting cosmic truth regarding the highly terrifying, deeply universally feared concept of human failure. The dark, heavily writhing entity completely, bitterly admits that the absolute, highly most incredibly lethal psychological weapon it possesses is the deeply toxic, highly paralyzing illusion that failure is an entirely permanent, completely absolute, and highly definitive condemnation of human worth. It maliciously, entirely aggressively utilizes temporary, deeply agonizing physical and financial setbacks to completely, violently crush the fragile human spirit, heavily entirely convincing the deeply terrified individual to completely, permanently surrender their magnificent, highly towering ambitions. But the fully awakened, completely sovereign non-drifter entirely, violently rejects this deeply fabricated, highly toxic cosmic lie. They fiercely, incredibly deeply recognize that absolutely every single agonizing, entirely unexpected, and highly painful failure inherently, completely inevitably carries within its incredibly dark, deeply heavy biological seed, the exact, highly entirely proportionate, and deeply magnificent equivalent of an incredibly massive, entirely transformative future benefit, the entirely invincible, deeply powerful human mind, completely, aggressively weapon is incredibly painful, highly devastating adversity, actively, fiercely utilizing the deeply agonizing, incredibly heavy emotional pain as a massive, entirely highly illuminating cosmic forge to aggressively, violently burn away deeply flawed, highly inefficient methodologies, heavily completely refining their highly focused, entirely unyielding approach until absolute, complete, and entirely undeniable victory is mathematically, completely fundamentally assured. They absolutely, fundamentally completely refuse to ever, under any incredibly difficult, entirely terrifying circumstance, deeply passively accept the highly toxic, entirely deeply paralyzing label of a permanently defeated victim. The dark entity profoundly, incredibly reluctantly entirely confesses that it absolutely, completely mathematically cannot ever hold, deeply manipulate, or entirely spiritually crush a human being who fiercely, continuously, and entirely aggressively chooses to actively learn from their deeply painful, highly crushing defeats rather than passively, entirely cowardly surrendering completely to them. The ultimate, incredibly heavy, entirely profound, and highly intense culmination of this incredibly grueling, entirely epic, completely terrifying, and highly profoundly liberating psychological and entirely cosmic interrogation profoundly, beautifully, entirely intensely reveals the absolute, incredibly majestic, completely unshakable, entirely mathematical core message and the incredibly deep, ultimate, entirely profoundly unassailable, entirely divine meaning that this fiercely suppressed, highly controversial, entirely profound, and completely historical book fiercely, aggressively, and beautifully intends to completely convey to its entirely highly awakened, deeply exhausted, and highly searching readers. It completely violently, aggressively, and beautifully tears down the absolute, entirely highly massive, deeply historically entrenched, entirely toxic, completely devastating, entirely universal illusion that ultimate, absolute, entirely pure, highly cosmic, entirely beautiful human failure, deep, highly heavy, entirely profound, completely inescapable human misery, and incredibly heavy, entirely unyielding, completely psychological despair are somehow, incredibly magically, deeply unfairly, entirely maliciously inflicted upon the fragile, deeply innocent, highly human race by a massive, entirely angry, deeply vengeful, completely external, entirely physical, deeply cosmic deity or a highly terrifying, incredibly massive, entirely subterranean, completely physical, highly mythological monster, the core, incredibly heavy, deeply beautiful, entirely unshakable, completely profound, entirely mathematical. Absolute message is that the entirety of the incredibly massive, highly dark, entirely destructive, completely limiting, incredibly heavy, deeply paralyzing power of the so-called devil strictly, entirely absolutely, completely fundamentally, entirely exclusively, incredibly perfectly resides completely within the deep, highly unexamined, completely vulnerable, entirely heavily guarded, completely absolute boundaries of your very own, incredibly deeply physical, entirely fragile, completely human mind. The book fiercely, aggressively, entirely beautifully serves as an incredibly deep, profound, entirely highly analytical, completely psychological, entirely surgical, completely beautiful blueprint for absolute, entirely incredible cognitive, completely profound, entirely divine human liberation. It aggressively, violently entirely teaches that by fiercely, ruthlessly entirely defining a completely absolute, highly non-negotiable major purpose, incredibly ruthlessly mastering your entirely biological appetites, entirely actively, fiercely rejecting any completely toxic, entirely dogmatic, completely fear-based external influence, completely intensely weaponizing incredibly painful, highly devastating temporary failures into massive, entirely highly illuminating cosmic lessons, and completely absolutely utilizing the massive, completely cosmic, entirely unyielding law of hypnotic rhythm, entirely specifically to absolutely violently lock deeply positive, entirely sovereign habits directly into your subconscious architecture. You completely, effectively, entirely beautifully, absolutely violently hack the deepest, completely most terrifying, entirely invisible psychological operating system of the known universe. By fiercely, aggressively executing this profoundly demanding, entirely unyielding cognitive discipline, you actively, fiercely ensure that you completely violently accelerate the deep, entirely profound, and completely absolute accumulation of complete, entirely undeniable, absolutely absolute cognitive and physical sovereignty, heavily permanently sealing the dark, completely heavily terrifying, entirely invisible gateway against the deeply insidious, entirely completely formless entity that aggressively, relentlessly seeks to passively completely consume your incredibly finite, highly precious mortal potential. The final, completely transcendent, incredibly powerful, absolutely absolute, and completely unshakable lesson is one of radical, completely terrifying, entirely beautifully uncompromising, incredibly absolute, deeply profound, completely divine liberation. You absolutely, fundamentally, completely mathematically do not ever have to passively, weakly entirely surrender the beautiful, finite, incredibly precious, entirely divine destiny of your mortal existence to the dark, incredibly heavy, highly toxic, entirely paralyzing grip of your own entirely unexamined, completely internally manufactured fears. Your absolute, entirely invincible freedom begins the exact, breathtaking fraction of a millisecond you possess the supreme, unyielding courage to violently evict the dark shadows of self-doubt and finally, entirely reclaim the sovereign throne of your own magnificent mind.